When Margaret Hartwell was cast out by her own family with a wooden sign reading "Barren" hung around her neck, she thought her life was over until she stumbled into the remote mountain cabin of Ezra Blackwood, a gentle giant who saw her not as a failure, but as the answer to his prayers. But when her vengeful family arrives with armed men to drag her back to an arranged marriage, will this unlikely pair's newfound love survive the confrontation that could destroy them both? The wooden sign bounced against Margaret's chest with each step, its rough edges cutting into her skin through her thin dress. Barren, the word her father had carved with his own hands, now hanging around her neck like a millstone. The autumn wind of 1847 whipped through the Montana territory, carrying the bitter scent of dying leaves and her family's final judgment. "Don't you dare look back." Her mother's voice had cut through the morning air, like a church bell tolling for the dead. 5 years married to James, and not even one baby to show for it. You've shamed us enough. Margaret's bare feet found the rocky trail that led away from Cedar Falls, away from everything she had ever known. The leather bag in her hands held her few belongings, a spare dress, her grandmother's Bible, and the last piece of bread she would ever eat from her mother's kitchen. Behind her, the town whispered and pointed, but she kept walking. The mountains ahead looked like sleeping giants, their peaks touching the gray sky. James had always said the Bitterroot Mountains were beautiful but dangerous, full of wild animals and wilder men. Now they seemed like her only choice. A decent woman wouldn't venture there alone, but then again, she wasn't considered decent anymore. Her wedding ring caught the pale sunlight as she walked. James had been kind to her, patient even when month after month brought no child. When the fever took him last spring, his family had waited exactly 1 week before declaring her curse had killed him too. God's punishment, they called it. A woman who can't bear children has no purpose. The trail grew steeper as she climbed, her city shoes slipping on loose stones. By noon, her stomach growled like an angry dog, but she had no money for food and no skills for finding it in the wild. The bread would have to last until she figured out what came next. A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. Margaret wondered if it was laughing at her foolishness. Where was she going? What would she do when winter came? The questions buzzed in her mind like angry bees, but she pushed them away, one step at a time. That's all she could manage. The sun was beginning to set when she heard the creek. Water meant life, and life meant hope. She followed the sound through a grove of pine trees, their needles soft under her aching feet. The stream was clear and cold, tasting better than any water she had ever drunk. As she cupped her hands for another drink, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the still water. The face looking back was thin and pale, with dark circles under green eyes that had once sparkled with dreams. The wooden sign floated beside her reflection like a curse made visible. She wanted to tear it off, throw it into the water, and watch it float away. But her father's words echoed in her memory. "You'll wear that sign until you find a man willing to take on damaged goods, if such a fool exists." A twig snapped behind her. Margaret spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The forest had grown dark while she wasn't paying attention, and now shadows moved between the trees like living things. She had heard stories about mountain lions and bears, about men who lived outside the law and feared nothing. Another sound, definitely footsteps this time, heavy boots on dry leaves. Margaret grabbed her bag and ran, crashing through the underbrush like a frightened deer. Branches tore at her dress and scratched her arms, but she didn't stop. The footsteps followed, getting closer. She burst into a clearing and stopped, so suddenly she nearly fell. A log cabin sat in the center of the open space, smoke rising from its stone chimney. Light glowed warm and yellow in the windows, and she could smell something cooking, meat and vegetables, that made her empty stomach twist with hunger. "You lost, lady?" The voice came from her left, deep and calm. Margaret turned to see a man step out from behind a tall pine tree. He was bigger than James had been, with broad shoulders and hands that looked strong enough to break her in half. His dark hair hung past his collar, and his beard was thick and untrimmed. Most frightening of all were his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, studying her with the patience of a hunter. This was it then. This was how her story would end. alone in the wilderness, facing a mountain man who probably hadn't seen a woman in months. Margaret lifted her chin and tried to look braver than she felt. "I'm not lost," she said, though her voice shook like a leaf in the wind. "I'm traveling." The man's gaze moved to the sign around her neck, and something in his expression changed. The hardness softened, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. "To where?" he asked, gesturing at the endless wilderness stretching in every direction. "Nothing up this way but my cabin, and a whole lot of hungry bears getting ready for winter." Margaret's stomach chose that moment to growl so loudly that even the mountain man heard it. His mouth twitched in what might have been a smile, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. When had she last eaten? The piece of bread this morning felt like a lifetime ago. "I suppose I'll have to make friends with the bears," she said, trying to sound confident. The words came out braver than she felt, but something in her tone made the man study her more carefully. "Name's Ezra Blackwood," he said, taking a step closer. "And I reckon you could use a meal before you start making friends with bears. They're not known for their manners." Margaret hesitated. Everything she had been taught screamed danger. A woman alone with a strange man in the wilderness was asking for trouble. But her empty belly and aching feet argued louder than her mother's warnings. "I don't have money to pay you," she admitted. "Didn't ask for money," Ezra gestured toward his cabin. "Asked if you wanted food. There's a difference." As they walked across the clearing, Margaret noticed things that surprised her. The cabin wasn't the rough shack she expected, but a solid building with glass windows and a well-built porch. A vegetable garden grew beside it, with late squash and pumpkins still growing on the vines. Someone had taken time to make this place beautiful, not just livable. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "Every log and nail," Ezra said with quiet pride. "Took 3 years, but I had nothing but time." Inside, the cabin was even more surprising. The main room was clean and comfortable, with handmade furniture arranged around a stone fireplace. But what made Margaret's breath catch were the books, shelves and shelves of them, more than she had seen outside the library in Cedar Falls. "You read?" The question popped out before she could stop it. "Man gets lonely up here," Ezra said, moving to the kitchen area. "Books are good company. They don't judge, don't ask questions, and they never leave you wondering where you stand." Margaret ran her fingers along the book spines, reading titles she recognized, and many she didn't. Poetry, history, science, stories from far-off places. This mountain man was nothing like what she had expected. "Sit down," Ezra said, pulling ingredients from various containers. "You look ready to fall over." She sank into a chair near the fireplace, and for the first time in days felt safe. The fire crackled cheerfully, and the smell of cooking food made her mouth water. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside was warm and peaceful. "Why do you live alone?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Ezra paused in his cooking. "Same reason you're running to nowhere instead of somewhere, I guess. Sometimes the world decides you don't fit, and you have to decide whether to keep trying to squeeze into spaces too small for you or find your own space." Margaret's hand moved to the sign around her neck. "And you chose your own space." "I did." He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and set it before her. "Question is, what are you choosing?" The stew was the most delicious thing Margaret had ever tasted, rich with meat and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. She ate slowly, trying to make it last, but her hungry body demanded more. "Easy," Ezra said gently. "You'll make yourself sick eating too fast after going without." "How do you know I've been going without? Your hands are shaking, you're thin as a rail, and you ate that stew like it was the first food you'd seen in a week." Ezra sat across from her with his own bowl. "Plus, nobody ends up in these mountains by accident. We're all running from something." Margaret set down her spoon. "What are you running from?" "My wife left me for another man," Ezra said simply. "Said I was too gentle, too quiet, not man enough for her." He shrugged. "Turns out she was right about one thing. I'm not the man she wanted. Took me a while to figure out that didn't make me wrong." "Do you miss her?" "I miss the idea of her. The life I thought we'd have." Ezra stirred his stew thoughtfully. but I don't miss feeling like I was failing every day just by being myself." Margaret understood that feeling perfectly. For 5 years, she had watched James's face fall each month when her monthly bleeding came, had seen the pity in neighbors' eyes when they asked about children and she had none to speak of, had felt like a broken thing, a woman who couldn't do the one thing women were supposed to do. "The sign," she said quietly. "My family made me wear it. Said I brought shame on both families by being barren." "And you believe that?" Margaret looked at him in surprise. "Believe what?" "That you're worth less because you can't have babies." The question hit her like a physical blow. She had never thought about it as a belief. It was simply truth, as solid as the mountains outside. She started, then stopped. "I don't know what else I could be worth." Ezra leaned forward. "You made this cabin feel different the moment you walked in. More alive somehow. You asked about my books like they mattered. You didn't flinch when I told you about my wife. Didn't look at me like I was less of a man for being left." He paused. "Seems to me you're worth plenty." Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. Margaret realized night had fallen completely while they talked, and she had nowhere to go. The thought should have terrified her, but sitting in this warm cabin with this gentleman, she felt safer than she had in months. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you get some sleep," Ezra said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." But as Margaret settled onto the small bed Ezra had prepared for her, she wondered if she was ready for tomorrow to come at all. Margaret woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood and sunlight streaming through windows she had forgotten weren't her own. For a moment, panic gripped her chest. Where was she? Then yesterday's memories flooded back. The long walk, the creek, Ezra's cabin, and the first kind words she had heard in months. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from sleeping on the narrow bed. Through the window, she could see Ezra working in the yard, his movements steady and strong as he chopped firewood. The sight made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. The cabin felt different in daylight, less mysterious, more like a real home. Someone had left fresh clothes on the chair beside her bed, a simple brown dress that looked like it might fit, along with sturdy boots and warm stockings. A note lay folded on top. "These belong to my sister. She'd want them used, E." Margaret touched the soft fabric with wonder. When had anyone last given her something without expecting payment or favors in return? The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. The boots were a little big, but warm wool stockings filled the extra space. Outside, Ezra had stopped chopping and was stacking the split logs with careful precision. Margaret watched through the window, noticing how he moved, not with the rough motions she expected from a mountain man, but with the careful grace of someone who had been taught to value things. "Morning," he called when she stepped onto the porch. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks." Margaret gestured to her new clothes. "Thank you for these. But I should tell you, I can't pay you back. I have nothing." Ezra leaned on his axe handle. "My sister died of fever 2 winters ago. She was about your size, and she always said her things should go to someone who needed them." He paused. "Besides, what good are dresses to a mountain man?" There was sadness in his voice when he mentioned his sister, but also something else. Acceptance, maybe, or peace with loss. Margaret recognized the feeling. She had carried grief for James, but lately it felt less like a weight and more like a gentle memory. "What was she like?" Margaret asked. "Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn. She wanted to be a teacher, but our parents said that was foolish for a woman." Ezra resumed his stacking. "She came up here after they died, said she was going to start a school for mountain children. The fever got her before she could try." Margaret felt a strange pull at the idea of teaching mountain children. She had always been good with letters and numbers, had even helped some of the younger children in Cedar Falls before her marriage. But that was another life, another version of herself. "Could I help with something?" she asked. "I feel strange just watching you work." Ezra looked surprised. "You don't have to earn your keep, Margaret. You're a guest. I'd rather be useful than comfortable." Something in her tone made him smile. "All right then. Can you cook?" "Better than most," Margaret said with the first real confidence she had felt in months. "Kitchen's yours then." I was planning venison stew for dinner, but I'm a plain cook at best. Working in Ezra's kitchen felt like stepping back into herself. The space was well organized, with good knives and sturdy pots, herbs hanging to dry from the rafters. As she prepared the stew, adding wild onions and dried berries she found in the pantry, Margaret realized she was humming something she hadn't done since James died. "That's a pretty tune," Ezra said from the doorway. Margaret blushed. "I didn't realize I was making noise." "Good noise," he said. "This place has been too quiet for too long." As the stew simmered, they worked together in easy silence. Ezra mended a torn shirt while Margaret organized his herb collection, finding it in worse disorder than a bird's nest. She sorted and labeled everything, creating a system that would make cooking easier. "You're good at this," Ezra observed, watching her work. "I like making things better," Margaret admitted. "More organized, more beautiful, more useful. James used to say I could organize a tornado if I put my mind to it. He sounds like he knew you well." Margaret paused in her sorting. "I thought he did. But when months passed without a baby, he got quieter and quieter. Toward the end, we barely talked at all." She looked up at Ezra. "Do you think some people are just meant to be alone?" "I think some people are told they should be alone by folks who don't understand them," Ezra said carefully. "That's different from actually being meant for it." That evening, as they ate dinner by firelight, Margaret felt something she had almost forgotten: contentment. The stew was delicious, the cabin was warm, and Ezra was easy company. He didn't fill every silence with chatter, but when he spoke, his words had weight. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said as they finished eating. "Of course. Yesterday you said you'd been alone for 3 years. Don't you get lonely?" Ezra considered the question seriously. "I did at first. Lonely enough to talk to my horse for hours just to hear a voice." He smiled. "But loneliness and being alone aren't the same thing. I was lonelier, married to a woman who didn't want me, than I've ever been in these mountains." Margaret understood. She had felt desperately lonely, even surrounded by family and neighbors in Cedar Falls. Everyone had opinions about what she should do, how she should feel, what was wrong with her. But none of them had actually seen her. "What will you do when winter comes?" Ezra asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Margaret had been avoiding thinking about it, but she couldn't stay in this borrowed safety forever. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been anywhere but Cedar Falls. I don't know what other places there are, or what a woman like me could do in them." "What kind of woman are you?" Margaret looked at him in surprise. "The broken kind, the shameful kind, the kind no decent family wants around." "That's what they told you? But what do you think?" The question was harder than any puzzle she had ever tried to solve. For so long, other people's opinions had been her truth. What did she think about herself? "I think," she started slowly, "I think I'm the kind of woman who can make a house feel like a home, who can take broken things and fix them, who can learn new things and remember old songs." She paused. "But I don't know if that's enough to build a life on." "Sounds like plenty to me," Ezra said quietly. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was coming. Time was running short for decisions, and Margaret felt the weight of an uncertain future pressing down on her shoulders. But for tonight, in this warm cabin with this kind man, she allowed herself to feel safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight was enough. The letter arrived with Pete Richardson, a grizzled trader who made monthly runs to the scattered mountain cabins. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line Ezra had strung between 2 pine trees when she heard horses approaching. Her hands froze on the wet sheet she was pinning up. After 2 weeks of peace, visitors felt like an invasion. "Morning, Ezra," Pete called out, dismounting near the cabin. "Got your supplies, and something extra." Margaret stayed hidden behind the laundry, but she could hear every word as Pete handed over a bundle of mail and packages. "Letter for a Margaret Hartwell," Pete said. "Funny thing, fellow in Cedar Falls paid me extra to make sure it got delivered personal-like. Said it was urgent family business." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. She recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope Ezra was holding, even from a distance. The paper looked official, with sharp creases and her father's careful script. "Margaret," Ezra called gently, "I think this is for you." Her hands shook as she took the letter. The last communication from her family had been her mother's voice telling her never to come back. What could they possibly want now? "Do you want to read it alone?" Ezra asked, noticing her pale face. Margaret shook her head. If this was bad news, and it surely was, she didn't want to face it by herself. She broke the wax seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the paper. "Margaret," the letter began in her father's stern voice, "your husband's family has made arrangements for your future. Samuel Morrison, a widower with 5 children, requires a wife to manage his household. You will return to Cedar Falls immediately to prepare for the wedding. Mr. Morrison is aware of your condition and has agreed to the match despite it. This is more than you deserve after the shame you have brought upon both families. A wagon will be sent for you within the month. Do not disappoint us further by refusing this generous offer. Your father, Reverend Hartwell." The paper fluttered to the ground as Margaret's legs gave out. Ezra caught her before she could fall, his strong arms steady and warm. "What does it say?" he asked. "They want to marry me off," Margaret whispered, "to a man I've never met, a widower with 5 children who needs a housekeeper, not a wife." Ezra's jaw tightened as he read the fallen letter. Samuel Morrison. I know that name. Pete mentioned him once. His last wife died in childbirth after their 5th baby. Word is he works them to death. Margaret felt trapped, like a bird in a cage that was getting smaller by the minute. "I can't go back, Ezra. I can't marry a stranger and spend my life raising other women's children while pretending to be grateful for the chance." "Then don't." The simple words hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Margaret looked up at Ezra's face, seeing something there she was afraid to name. "Where else can I go? What else can I do?" Margaret's voice cracked. "I have no money, no skills that matter, no family that wants me. Maybe this is just what my life is supposed to be." "Your life is supposed to be whatever you choose to make it," Ezra said firmly. "Nobody else gets to decide that for you. Easy for you to say. You're a man. You can live alone in the mountains, and people call you independent. If I do it, they call me crazy or worse." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had become his refuge. Finally, he spoke. "What if you didn't have to do it alone?" Margaret's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if you stayed here? With me?" The words hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful but fragile. Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Ezra, you barely know me. I could be terrible company. I could drive you crazy within a week. You've been here 2 weeks already, and this cabin has felt more like home than it has in 3 years, Ezra said quietly. "You hum while you work, and it makes everything feel alive. You organize my chaos and cook meals that taste like they were made with love. You ask about my books and actually listen to the answers." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. But what would people say? A woman living with a man she's not married to? What people? Pete comes by once a month, and the nearest neighbor is 15 miles away. Ezra took her hands in his. "Margaret, I'm not asking you to be my housekeeper or my charity case. I'm asking if you'd consider being my partner, my friend, my more than friend, if you're willing." "But I'm barren," Margaret whispered. "I can't give you children." "I don't want children," Ezra said with surprising firmness. "I want you, just you, exactly as you are." Margaret felt something break open in her chest. Not pain, but relief so strong it made her dizzy. Here was a man who knew her worst shame and didn't care, who saw her as enough, just as she was. "The letter says they're sending a wagon within the month," she said practically. "Then we have time to figure things out." Before Margaret could respond, Pete cleared his throat loudly. They had forgotten he was still there, loading supplies onto Ezra's porch. "Don't mean to interrupt," Pete said with a knowing grin, "but I couldn't help overhearing. If you folks are thinking of making things official, like I'm ordained. Been performing marriages for mountain folks for 20 years. Margaret and Ezra looked at each other in surprise. "We weren't." Margaret started. "Might be worth considering." Pete continued, ignoring her protest. Legal marriage makes things simpler, gives you rights, protection. Can't nobody force a married woman to leave her husband for another man? The idea was crazy, impossible, wonderful, and terrifying all at once. Margaret had known Ezra for 2 weeks. People didn't get married after 2 weeks. But then again, people didn't usually get cast out by their families for being barren either. Maybe impossible situations called for impossible solutions. Think about it, Pete said, tipping his hat. I'll be back this way in 2 weeks. If you decide you want to make it legal, I can do the ceremony then. As Pete rode away, Margaret and Ezra stood in silence, both lost in thought. The letter lay forgotten on the ground between them, its threats suddenly seeming less powerful. It's crazy, Margaret said finally. Completely crazy, Ezra agreed. We barely know each other. True. People will think we've lost our minds. Probably. Margaret looked at him sideways. Are you trying to talk me out of it, or into it? Ezra's smile was slow and warm. I'm trying to be honest. It is crazy, and we don't know each other well, and people will think we're fools. He paused. But I'd rather be a fool with you than sensible without you. Margaret felt her heart do something that might have been dancing. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her, not settling for her, not doing their duty by her, but actually choosing her. Ask me again in 2 weeks, she said softly, when Pete comes back. And if you say yes? Margaret looked around at the cabin that had become home, the mountains that had sheltered her, and the man who had shown her kindness when the world had shown her cruelty. If I say yes, then I guess we'll find out what happens when 2 broken people try to build something whole together. The sound of galloping horses shattered the peaceful morning like gunshots echoing through the valley. Margaret dropped the basket of eggs she was gathering and ran toward the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the trees, she could see 3 riders approaching fast, their horses lathered with sweat from hard travel. Ezra, she called, but he was already stepping out of the cabin with his rifle in hand. The lead rider was a man Margaret had never seen before, thin and sharp-faced, with cold eyes that swept over her like she was livestock at market. Behind him rode 2 men she recognized with sinking dread. Her father, Reverend Hartwell, sitting ramrod straight in his saddle, and Deputy Clark from Cedar Falls, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Margaret Hartwell, the stranger called out as he dismounted. I am Samuel Morrison, your intended husband. You will gather your belongings immediately. We have a wedding to prepare for. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. This was the man they expected her to marry? Samuel Morrison looked like he could break a horse with his bare hands and wouldn't think twice about breaking a woman the same way. His smile had no warmth in it, just the satisfaction of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. I'm not going anywhere, Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. You most certainly are, her father said, dismounting with the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. Mr. Morrison has been generous enough to overlook your shameful behavior and offer you marriage despite your failings. You will not embarrass our family further. Ezra stepped closer to Margaret, his presence solid and reassuring. The lady has made her feelings clear. She's not interested in Mr. Morrison's generous offer. Samuel Morrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Lady, this barren woman is no lady. She's damaged goods that I'm willing to take off her family's hands. His eyes moved over Margaret with obvious distaste. 5 children need a mother, and she needs a purpose. The arrangement benefits us both. I don't want to marry you, Margaret said clearly. I don't even know you. Want? Morrison stepped closer, and Margaret caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. What does want have to do with anything? You're a useless woman with no prospects. You should be grateful anyone would have you. Ezra's hand tightened on his rifle. I think you've said enough. And I think you've interfered enough, Deputy Clark interrupted, his hand resting on his gun. Margaret Hartwell is legally under her father's authority until she remarries. She'll come with us willingly, or I'll arrest her for vagrancy and indecent behavior. Margaret felt the familiar weight of powerlessness settling over her like a heavy blanket. All her life, Other people had made decisions for her, her parents, her husband's family, and now these men who saw her as property to be traded. But then Ezra reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "Actually, Deputy," he said calmly, "she's not under anyone's authority anymore." Reverend Hartwell's face turned red. "What do you mean?" "Margaret and I were married yesterday," Ezra said, unfolding the paper. "Pete Richardson witnessed it and performed the ceremony. He's been ordained for 30 years. Margaret stared at Ezra in shock. They had done no such thing, but his eyes held hers steadily, asking for trust without words. The certificate in his hands looked official, with careful handwriting and proper seals. "That's impossible," Morrison sputtered. "She was promised to me. I paid good money for travel expenses." "You can't promise what doesn't belong to you," Ezra replied quietly, "and Margaret belongs to herself." Deputy Clark examined the paper with a frown. "This looks legitimate. Pete's signature, proper date, territorial seal." Margaret realized that Ezra must have prepared this somehow, maybe even getting Pete to help create the false document. The thought should have shocked her, but instead, she felt grateful for his quick thinking. "This is an abomination," Reverend Hartwell declared. "I will not recognize this mockery of holy matrimony performed by some backwoods trader." "Fortunately, the territorial government will," Ezra said mildly, "and that's what matters legally." Morrison's face had turned an ugly purple color. "You think you can steal what was promised to me? I have a contract with her family. A contract about a person who couldn't agree to it herself," Margaret said, finding courage in Ezra's steady presence. "That's not a marriage contract, Mr. Morrison. That's a bill of sale." The three men stood in angry silence while Margaret felt something powerful growing inside her chest. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her right to choose her own path. "If you choose this path, Margaret," her father said, his voice cold as winter stone, "you are no daughter of mine. You will never be welcome in Cedar Falls again. Never." Margaret felt the last thread connecting her to her old life snap. It should have hurt more, but instead she felt oddly light, like a bird that had just discovered it could fly. "I understand, Father," she said simply. Morrison wasn't finished. "This isn't over. No one makes a fool of Samuel Morrison and gets away with it." "Is that a threat?" Ezra asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's a promise," Morrison snarled. "Enjoy your barren wife while you can, mountain man. Winter's coming, and mountains can be dangerous places for people who don't belong." The three men mounted their horses and rode away, but Morrison's words hung in the air like storm clouds. Margaret watched until they disappeared into the trees, then turned to face Ezra. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "Since the day your father's letter arrived," Ezra admitted. "I asked Pete about it when he brought supplies. He said he'd help if it came to that." "But why? Why would you tie yourself to someone like me?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, looking out at the mountains that had become their refuge. "Because for the first time in 3 years, I look forward to waking up in the morning," he said finally. "Because you make this place feel alive. Because when you laugh, really laugh, it's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest like sunshine after rain. "The certificate. Could we make it real?" she asked quietly. Ezra's smile was gentle and sure. "Margaret, I've been wanting to ask you properly for days. I just didn't know if you could see me as more than a convenient escape. Is that what you think this is for me? Isn't it?" Margaret considered carefully. "At first, maybe. But Ezra, you make me feel like myself. Not the woman everyone wanted me to be, just me." "Then yes," Ezra said, taking her hands. "Let's make it real." The real wedding took place 3 days later, when Pete returned with his wife Martha in tow. They had brought fresh bread, preserves, and even a small bottle of wine to celebrate. "Now this is how it should be done," Pete declared as he opened his worn prayer book. "Two people choosing each other with clear hearts and honest intentions." Martha, a plump woman with kind eyes, had insisted on braiding wildflowers into Margaret's hair. "Every bride needs flowers," she said firmly. "Doesn't matter if it's in a church or a clearing." As Pete spoke the familiar words about love and commitment, Margaret felt something settle into place inside her chest. This wasn't the grand wedding she had dreamed of as a girl, but it was real in a way her first marriage had never been. James had married her because it was expected. Ezra was marrying her because he chose to. Do you, Ezra Blackwood, take Margaret Hartwell to be your wife? To love and cherish in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Ezra said, his voice strong and certain. Do you, Margaret Hartwell, take Ezra Blackwood to be your husband, to love and honor in good times and bad, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live? Margaret looked into Ezra's blue eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not perfect, but honest and full of possibility. I do, she said. Then, by the authority given to me, by the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. As Ezra kissed her gently, Margaret heard Martha cheering and Pete laughing. The sound echoed off the mountain walls like a celebration made of pure joy. That evening, as they shared dinner and stories around the fire, Margaret felt truly happy for the first time in years. Pete told tales of other mountain couples he had married, while Martha shared recipes and practical advice for surviving the harsh winters. You'll need to stock up on supplies before the first snow, Martha warned. Once winter sets in proper, you won't see another soul until spring. How long does winter last up here? Margaret asked. 4 months, sometimes 5, Pete said. But don't worry, you've got everything you need. Good cabin, plenty of firewood, and each other. After their guests left the next morning, Margaret and Ezra settled into married life with surprising ease. They worked together during the day, preserving food, chopping wood, preparing for winter, and spent evenings reading by the fire or simply talking. Margaret discovered that marriage to Ezra was nothing like marriage to James had been. Where James had been polite but distant, Ezra was warm and present. Where James had grown quieter as months passed without children, Ezra seemed genuinely content with just her company. Do you ever think about children? Margaret asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold. I think about the children we might help someday, Ezra said carefully. Mountain kids who need teaching maybe, or youngsters whose families can't care for them properly. Margaret felt something ease in her chest. You mean we could still matter to children, even if we don't have our own? We can matter to lots of people in lots of ways, Ezra said. Having babies is just one way to make a difference in the world. As autumn deepened, and the first frost touched the higher peaks, Margaret threw herself into preparing for winter. She dried herbs, preserved vegetables, and even learned to smoke meat the way Ezra's sister had taught him years before. But even as she worked, Margaret couldn't shake the memory of Samuel Morrison's parting words. Mountains could be dangerous places, he had said. Was that just angry bluster, or something more serious? Her question was answered on a cold October morning when she woke to find their vegetable garden destroyed. Someone had trampled the late squash and pulled up the root vegetables, leaving them scattered and ruined. Animals? Margaret asked hopefully, though she knew better. Ezra examined the damage grimly. No animal did this. Look at the boot prints. Sure enough, clear heel marks showed where someone had deliberately destroyed their winter food supply. Morrison, Margaret whispered. Maybe. Or someone he hired. Ezra's jaw was tight with anger. Whoever it was knows we depend on this food to get through winter. Margaret felt cold fear creep up her spine. Without the vegetables, they would have to rely entirely on hunting and their stored supplies. If anything went wrong, if Ezra got injured, if the weather turned especially harsh, they could find themselves in real trouble. What do we do? She asked. We survive, Ezra said firmly. We're not the first mountain folks to face a hard winter, and we won't be the last. But that night, as Margaret lay beside her new husband listening to the wind howl through the trees, she wondered if surviving would be enough. Morrison had made it clear this wasn't over and winter was still months away. Plenty of time for a determined man to cause more trouble. Outside, something moved in the darkness beyond their windows. Margaret held her breath, straining to hear over the wind. Was it just an animal, or something more dangerous? Ezra's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and reassuring. Whatever came next, at least they would face it together. But as sleep finally claimed her, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were just beginning. The trapline was empty again, and this time Ezra found something that made his blood run cold, fresh boot prints circling each snare, with the metal springs deliberately sprung and left useless. Someone was sabotaging their ability to hunt, and winter was only weeks away. "Third time this week," he muttered, kneeling to examine the damaged traps. The work was too careful to be accidental, too systematic to be random mischief. Someone wanted them to fail, and they were getting bolder about it. Back at the cabin, Margaret was grinding the last of their wheat into flour when she heard Ezra's horse approaching. One look at his grim expression told her everything she needed to know. "The traps?" she asked. "All of them. Whoever's doing this knows exactly where I set my lines." Ezra hung his rifle on its pegs and slumped into his chair. "At this rate, we'll be living on stored beans and dried corn all winter." Margaret set down her grinding stone and moved to the window. The mountains looked beautiful in their coat of early snow, but she was beginning to see them differently, not as a refuge, but as a prison that could trap them with an enemy they couldn't see. "Maybe we should leave," she said quietly. "Find somewhere else to spend the winter." "And go where?" "This is our home now, Margaret. If we run every time someone tries to scare us, we'll spend our whole lives running." Margaret knew he was right, but the constant worry was wearing her down. Every sound outside made her jump. Every time Ezra left to check the traps, she wondered if he would come back safely. "There's something else," Ezra said hesitantly. "I found this nailed to a tree near the creek." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. The message was written in block letters, obviously disguised. "Leave now or face the consequences. The mountains don't forgive fools." Margaret felt her hands shake as she read the crude threat. "Do you think it's Morrison?" "Could be. Or someone he hired. Or—" Ezra paused, looking troubled. "Pete mentioned there are men who don't like outsiders settling in these mountains. Claim the territory belongs to folks who were here first." The idea that their troubles might come from multiple sources made Margaret feel sick. She had thought their biggest challenge would be surviving the weather, not fighting off human enemies. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Ezra grabbed his rifle while Margaret moved away from the windows. Who would be traveling this late in the day, with snow threatening in the dark clouds overhead? "Ezra? Margaret? It's Doc Henderson from Missoula." Margaret had never heard the name, but Ezra relaxed and opened the door. A middle-aged man stood on their porch, his medical bag in one hand and his horse's reins in the other. "Doc, what brings you up here so late?" Ezra asked, helping the man inside. "Got word there might be trouble brewing?" Doc Henderson said, gratefully accepting a cup of hot coffee. "Pete Richardson asked me to check on you folks. Said someone might be trying to cause problems before winter sets in." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. "Pete sent you?" "Pete, and a few others. There's a loose network of mountain folks who look out for each other. When we heard someone was threatening newlyweds, well," Doc Henderson smiled grimly, "we decided that wasn't acceptable." "You mean we're not alone up here?" Margaret asked in surprise. "Lord, no. There are maybe 20 families scattered through these mountains. Most keep to themselves. But when push comes to shove, we stick together." Doc Henderson pulled out a small notebook. "Pete told me about your troubles. Destroyed garden, ruined trap lines, threatening notes." "You think you know who's doing it?" Ezra asked. "I've got suspicions. There's a group of men who've been making noise about wanting to control who settles where in the territory. Led by a fellow named Jake Murdoch, mean as a rattlesnake and twice as dangerous." Margaret had never heard of Jake Murdoch, but the name made Ezra tense up. "I know Murdoch," Ezra said grimly. "He tried to run my sister off her claim 2 years ago. Said women had no business owning land in the mountains." "What happened?" Margaret asked. She stood her ground, had her rifle, and knew how to use it. Ezra's expression darkened, but then the fever got her, and Murdoch moved some of his men onto her land anyway. Doc Henderson nodded. "That's his way. He doesn't like to get his hands dirty directly, but he's got men who will do whatever he asks." Margaret felt pieces clicking into place. So this might not be about Morrison at all. Could be both. Doc Henderson said. Morrison wants you specifically, but Murdoch wants all newcomers gone. They might be working together. The thought of facing enemies on two fronts made Margaret's stomach twist with fear. But then she looked around the cabin that had become home, at the man who had chosen to marry her, at the life they were building together. What do we do? She asked. First, we make sure you're not alone, Doc Henderson said. I'm going to spread word that you need help. By tomorrow evening, you'll have neighbors close enough to hear a gunshot. And second? Ezra asked. Doc Henderson's smile was sharp as a blade. Second, we remind Jake Murdoch that mountain folks don't take kindly to bullies. That night, as snow began to fall in earnest, Margaret lay awake listening to every sound outside. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't listening in fear. She was listening with the knowledge that they had allies, that other people cared about their safety. Ezra, she whispered in the darkness, I'm awake. Do you think we'll really be okay? Ezra's arm tightened around her. I think we're stronger than our enemies know, and I think they're about to find out what happens when mountain folks decide to fight back. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside their cabin, Margaret finally felt safe enough to sleep. Margaret woke to the sound of axes and saws echoing through the valley like a symphony of defiance. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see men working in the gray dawn light, building something large and sturdy near the creek. What's happening? She asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Ezra was already dressed and heating coffee on the stove. Doc Henderson wasn't kidding about mountain folk sticking together. They started arriving before sunrise. Outside, Margaret counted at least a dozen men working with the efficient coordination of people who had done this before. They were building a cabin, not a large one, but solid and weatherproof. For us? Margaret asked in amazement. For Tom and Sarah Mitchell, Ezra explained. They've been living in a tent while Tom recovers from a broken leg. Doc thought having neighbors close by would benefit everyone. Margaret watched the men work, their breath steaming in the cold air. She had never seen anything like it, a whole community coming together to help strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. Mrs. Blackwood? A woman's voice called from outside. Margaret opened the door to find a tall, sturdy woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Behind her stood two younger women, both carrying baskets that smelled of fresh bread and stew. I'm Ruth Morrison. No relation to that Samuel Morrison fellow, the woman said quickly. My husband Ben is the one directing the building. We brought food for everyone. Please come in, Margaret said, grateful for the warmth of human company. As the women set up an impromptu feast in Margaret's small kitchen, she learned more about the mountain community she had never known existed. Ruth had been homesteading with her husband for 15 years. The younger women, sisters named Kate and Lucy, had started a small sheep ranch, 2 valleys over. We heard about your troubles, Kate said as she sliced bread. Jake Murdoch's been trying to drive out newcomers for months, especially women who own property. Why women especially? Margaret asked. Because we prove that women can survive just fine without men like him, Lucy said with a sharp smile. Jake's got old-fashioned ideas about a woman's place. Ruth nodded grimly. He's been spreading stories about how dangerous it is for women alone in the mountains. Claims he's protecting us by trying to run us off. Margaret felt anger building in her chest. So he causes the danger and then claims to be protecting us from it? Exactly, Kate said. But he's about to learn that mountain women aren't as helpless as he thinks. Through the window, Margaret could see the men raising the walls of the new cabin with impressive speed. By noon, they had the frame up and were working on the roof. Tom Mitchell, despite his recently healed leg, was directing the work from a makeshift chair. Amazing what people can accomplish when they work together, Ruth observed. As the day progressed, Margaret found herself in the middle of a community she had never imagined. The women shared stories, recipes, and practical advice while the men built. Children played in the snow, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But the peaceful scene was shattered when riders appeared on the ridge above them. Jake Murdoch, Ben Morrison said grimly, setting down his hammer. Margaret counted 8 men on horseback, silhouetted against the gray sky like harbingers of trouble. Even from a distance, their hostile intent was clear. Everyone stay calm, Ben called out. Let them make the first move. The riders descended slowly, deliberately, their horses' hooves crunching in the snow. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with cold eyes and a smile that promised violence. Well, well, Jake Murdoch called out as he dismounted. Looks like we've got ourselves a regular barn raising. Too bad you're all building on land that doesn't belong to you. This is Tom Mitchell's legal claim, Ben Morrison replied calmly. Filed proper with the territorial office and everything. Papers don't mean much out here, Murdoch said, gesturing to his armed men. What means something is who's strong enough to hold what they claim. Margaret felt fear creep up her spine, but she also felt something else. Anger at these men who thought they could terrorize families just trying to build honest lives. You're trespassing, Murdoch, Ezra said, stepping forward with his rifle cradled casually in his arms. Am I? Murdoch's eyes found Margaret and lingered with obvious contempt. Heard you married yourself a barren woman, Blackwood. Must be desperate for company to take on damaged goods. Watch your mouth, Ezra warned, his voice dangerously quiet. Or what? You'll hide behind your wife's skirts? Murdoch laughed. Face it, Blackwood. You and your friends here are outnumbered and outgunned. Time to pack up and find somewhere else to play house. Actually, a new voice said from the tree line, I think you're the one who's outnumbered. Margaret turned to see Doc Henderson emerging from the woods with at least 15 more men, all armed and looking grim. Behind them came Pete Richardson and his wagon, loaded with what looked like enough supplies for a siege. Murdoch's confidence wavered as he realized he was facing a small army of determined mountain folks. This isn't over, he snarled, remounting his horse. Yes, it is, Doc Henderson said firmly. The territorial governor is a friend of mine, Jake. One word from me about you threatening legal settlers and you'll have federal marshals breathing down your neck. For a moment, tension crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Then Murdoch wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following like the cowards they were. As the hoofbeats faded into distance, Margaret felt something settle into place inside her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She was part of something bigger, a community that looked out for its own. Well, Ruth Morrison said cheerfully, now that the excitement's over, who wants pie? The laughter that followed echoed off the mountains like a promise of better days to come. The scream that shattered the peaceful winter morning came from the direction of the Mitchell cabin, high and desperate enough to freeze Margaret's blood in her veins. She dropped the wood she was carrying and ran through the knee-deep snow, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sarah Mitchell stood in her doorway, her face white as the snow around her, pointing toward the forest with a shaking hand. Tom went to check the rabbit snares an hour ago, she gasped. I heard a gunshot, then nothing. Margaret grabbed Sarah's shoulders. Are you sure it was a gunshot? I know the difference between a gunshot and a tree falling, Sarah said, tears freezing on her cheeks. Something's wrong. Tom always comes back when he says he will. Ezra appeared at Margaret's side, already pulling on his heavy coat and checking his rifle. How far are the snares? Half a mile up the creek, near the big boulder, Sarah said. Please find him, with his bad leg if he's hurt. Margaret watched Ezra disappear into the forest, following Tom's tracks in the snow. The waiting was agony. Every minute that passed felt like an hour. Every sound from the woods made her jump. Sarah paced in her cabin like a caged animal, unable to sit still. He'll be fine, Margaret said, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Tom's been living in these mountains for years. He knows how to take care of himself. But even as she spoke, Margaret remembered Jake Murdoch's cold eyes and his promise that this wasn't over. Had he made good on his threats? Was Tom lying hurt somewhere because of their fight with the mountain bullies? The sound of voices carried through the trees, Ezra calling for help. Margaret's stomach dropped like a stone. Stay here, she told Sarah, then ran toward the voices before Sarah could argue. She found them by the creek, where Tom lay motionless in the snow with blood staining the white ground around him. Ezra was kneeling beside him, pressing a cloth against a wound in Tom's shoulder. Is he? Margaret couldn't finish the question. Alive, but barely, Ezra said grimly. Looks like someone shot him and left him to freeze. If we hadn't found him soon. Margaret knelt in the snow and felt for Tom's pulse. It was weak but steady, and his breathing was shallow but regular. We need to get him back to the cabin and warm. Carefully, Ezra warned. I don't know how bad the bleeding is. They managed to get Tom back to his cabin, where Sarah had already prepared blankets and hot water. Margaret had helped with injuries before. Farm accidents were common in Cedar Falls, but nothing as serious as a gunshot wound. The bullet went through, Ezra said after examining the wound. That's good. Means we don't have to dig it out, but he's lost a lot of blood. For the next 3 hours, Margaret and Sarah worked to save Tom's life. They cleaned the wound, stopped the bleeding, and slowly warmed his frozen body. Margaret had never felt more useful than she did in those moments, using skills she hadn't known she possessed. Will he live? Sarah whispered as Tom's color slowly returned to normal. I think so, Margaret said, but he'll need time to heal, and someone tried to kill him. We can't pretend this was an accident. Ezra had been examining the area around where they found Tom. When he returned, his face was dark with anger. Boot prints, he said. Same size and pattern as the ones we found in our garden. Someone followed Tom to the snares, shot him, and left him to die. Murdoch, Sarah said, her voice shaking with rage. Maybe. Or one of his men. Ezra sat heavily in a chair. Either way, this changes things. They're not just trying to scare us anymore. They're trying to kill us. Margaret felt cold fear settle in her stomach. She had thought the worst of their troubles were over after the community had stood up to Murdoch. But apparently, their enemies were more dangerous than anyone had realized. What do we do? She asked. We get help, Ezra said firmly. Doc Henderson needs to know about this, and so does the territorial government. Shooting a man and leaving him to die isn't just bullying, it's attempted murder. That evening, as Tom slept fitfully, and Sarah kept watch beside his bed, Margaret stood at her cabin window staring out at the forest. Somewhere, in those dark trees, men with guns were planning their next move. The community that had felt so safe just days ago now seemed fragile and vulnerable. We could still leave, she said quietly, when Ezra joined her at the window. Is that what you want? Margaret thought about it seriously. Part of her did want to run, to pack their belongings and find somewhere safer to build their life together. But another part of her, a stronger part, refused to be driven away by bullies and killers. No, she said finally. This is our home. Tom and Sarah are our friends. If we run away, who's next? Kate and Lucy? Ruth and Ben? Ezra nodded approvingly. Then we stay and fight. Even if it's dangerous? Especially because it's dangerous. Ezra put his arm around her shoulders. Someone has to stand up to men like Murdoch, or they'll keep hurting innocent people. Margaret leaned against her husband's solid warmth and tried to draw strength from his certainty. But as she watched the shadows move between the trees, she couldn't shake the feeling that their real troubles were just beginning. Tomorrow, Doc Henderson would ride to the territorial capital to report the shooting. But tonight, they were on their own with a wounded man and enemies who had already proven they were willing to kill. Margaret checked the locks on their doors and windows, then sat by the fire with Ezra's rifle across her lap. If Murdoch's men came for them in the darkness, they would find her ready. The letter arrived with the morning supply wagon, carried by a nervous young driver who kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting trouble to follow him up the mountain trail. The official territorial seal on the envelope made Margaret's hands shake as she broke it open. What does it say? Ezra asked, setting down his coffee cup. Margaret read the formal language twice before the meaning sank in. The territorial governor is sending federal marshals to investigate Tom's shooting. But, she paused, her stomach dropping. Jake Murdoch has filed a complaint claiming we're the ones causing trouble. He says we're armed squatters threatening peaceful settlers. That's backwards, Ezra said angrily. He's the one who shot Tom. But we can't prove it, Margaret said, sinking into her chair. All we have are boot prints and suspicions. Murdoch probably has men willing to swear they were somewhere else when the shooting happened. The young wagon driver cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am? There's something else. Fellow in Missoula asked me to give you this. He handed Margaret a second letter, this one sealed with black wax. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, but something about it made her uneasy. What now? Ezra muttered as Margaret opened the second letter. This message was short and direct. Your husband killed my brother in a mining dispute 3 years ago. I know where you live now. Justice is coming. Frank Coleman. Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. Ezra? Who is Frank Coleman? Ezra's face went pale as he read the letter. His brother was Eddie Coleman. He tried to jump my sister's mining claim after she died. When I went to stop him, Ezra sat down heavily. There was a fight. Eddie fell and hit his head on a rock. I never meant for him to die. You killed someone? Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. It was self-defense. Eddie came at me with a pickaxe, said no woman's brother was going to stop him from taking what he wanted. Ezra's hands shook as he set down the letter. The territorial judge ruled it a justified killing, but Frank swore he'd get revenge someday. Margaret felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. In one morning, she had learned that federal marshals were coming to investigate them, that Jake Murdoch was claiming they were the criminals, and that someone else entirely wanted to kill her husband for revenge. How many enemies do we have? She asked weakly. Too many, Ezra admitted, and now they're all closing in at once. The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the window, Margaret could see 3 riders coming up the trail, but these weren't the rough mountain men they had been expecting. These men wore clean clothes and official badges, their horses well-groomed and their bearing professional. Federal marshals, Ezra said grimly. That was fast. The lead marshal dismounted with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was middle-aged and competent-looking, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the cabin and its surroundings. I'm Marshal Davies, he announced. This is Marshal Brown and Marshal Tucker. We're here to investigate reports of violence and illegal activity in this area. Come in, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. We've been expecting you. As the marshals settled around their small table, Margaret served coffee and tried to read their expressions. They were polite but watchful, clearly unsure who to believe in this tangle of accusations and counter-accusations. We've received conflicting reports, Marshal Davies said, pulling out a notebook. Jake Murdoch claims you folks are armed squatters who shot Tom Mitchell when he tried to evict you from his land. But Doc Henderson says Murdoch's men shot Mitchell while he was checking rabbit snares on his own property. Tom's claim is legally filed, Ezra said, producing the official documents. He has every right to be on that land. Marshal Brown examined the papers carefully. These look legitimate, but Murdoch has papers too, a deed claiming prior ownership of the same territory. Margaret's heart sank. A forged deed? That's what we're here to determine, Marshal Davies said. In the meantime, we're going to need statements from everyone involved. For the next 2 hours, Margaret and Ezra told their story, from Margaret's arrival at the cabin through the community's stand against Murdoch to Tom's shooting. The marshals listened without comment, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions. One more thing, Marshal Davies said as they prepared to leave. We've heard there might be other parties involved in this dispute. Someone named Frank Coleman? Margaret and Ezra exchanged glances. He sent us a threatening letter this morning, Margaret admitted, handing over Frank's message. Marshal Tucker read the letter and frowned. This changes things. If Coleman is seeking personal revenge, it muddies the water considerably. What do you mean? Margaret asked. I mean, we might be dealing with 3 separate conflicts that just happen to be happening in the same place at the same time, Marshal Davies explained. Land disputes, personal revenge, and simple bullying. It's going to take time to sort out who's telling the truth. As the marshals rode away to interview other witnesses, Margaret felt exhausted by the weight of uncertainty. Everything she thought she knew about their situation had become complicated and confusing. What if they decide we're the criminals? She asked Ezra. Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Ezra said, though he didn't sound as confident as his words. Right now, all we can do is tell the truth and hope it's enough. But as Margaret watched the marshals disappear down the trail, she wondered if the truth would be enough to save them from the enemies gathering like storm clouds on every horizon. That night, she lay awake, listening to every sound outside their cabin, wondering which threat would reach them first: Murdoch's men, Frank Coleman's revenge, or the federal government's justice. The explosion that shattered the pre-dawn quiet sent Margaret tumbling from her bed onto the cabin floor. her ears ringing, and her heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. Through the smoke-filled air, she could see orange flames dancing where the Mitchell cabin had stood just moments before. "Sarah!" Margaret screamed, pulling on her boots and coat while Ezra grabbed his rifle and medical supplies. They ran through the snow toward the blazing wreckage, joined by other neighbors who had heard the blast. What they found made Margaret's stomach turn. The cabin had been blown apart by dynamite, its wooden walls scattered like matchsticks across the clearing. "Tom! Sarah!" Ezra shouted, searching frantically through the debris. "Over here!" Ben Morrison's voice called from the tree line. "They're alive!" Margaret found Tom and Sarah huddled behind a large pine tree, both shaking from cold and shock but miraculously unhurt. Sarah was clutching a water bucket, and Tom held his rifle despite his wounded shoulder. "What happened?" Margaret asked, wrapping her coat around Sarah's trembling form. "Someone threw dynamite through our window," Tom said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "We were lucky. I couldn't sleep because of my shoulder, so we were sitting by the back door when it happened." "Did you see who did it?" Ezra asked. "3 men on horseback," Sarah said. "They rode away fast after the explosion, heading toward Murdoch's territory." Margaret stared at the burning remains of the cabin that had been built with such hope and community spirit just weeks ago. The message was clear. Anyone who stood with the Blackwoods would pay the price. "This has gone too far," Ben Morrison said angrily. "Shooting a man was bad enough, but trying to blow up a family in their sleep? That's attempted murder." Doc Henderson arrived just as the sun was rising, his medical bag in hand and fury written across his weathered face. "Anyone hurt?" "Just shaken up," Margaret reported. "But Doc, they used dynamite. This wasn't some scare tactic. They were trying to kill Tom and Sarah." "I know." Doc Henderson's expression was grim. "And I know where they got the dynamite. Jake Murdoch's been buying mining supplies in Missoula, claiming he's starting a new operation." The revelation sent murmurs of anger through the gathered neighbors. Using dynamite against families crossed a line that even hardened mountain folks couldn't tolerate. "Where are the federal marshals?" Ruth Morrison demanded. "Aren't they supposed to be investigating this?" "They're interviewing witnesses in town," Doc Henderson said. "But by the time they get back up here, there might not be any witnesses left alive." Margaret felt cold fear settle in her bones. The enemies were escalating faster than the law could respond, and innocent people were paying the price for her decision to stand her ground. "Maybe we should have left when we had the chance," she whispered to Ezra. "It's not your fault," Ezra said firmly. "You didn't throw that dynamite. You didn't choose to hurt innocent people." But Margaret couldn't shake the guilt that ate at her like acid. Tom and Sarah had lost their home because they had become her neighbors. How many other people would suffer before this was over? "We need to take this fight to them," Kate Morrison said, her young face hard with determination. "Sitting here waiting for the next attack isn't working." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I mean we ride to Murdoch's camp and demand answers," Kate continued. "If he wants a war, we'll give him one." "That's exactly what he wants," Doc Henderson warned. "The moment we attack first, we become the criminals in the marshal's eyes." Margaret listened to the debate swirling around her and felt torn between competing emotions. Part of her wanted justice for Tom and Sarah. Part of her wanted to run as far from this violence as possible. But the strongest part of her wanted to protect the community that had welcomed her when her own family had cast her out. "There's something else," Tom said quietly, drawing everyone's attention. "Before the explosion, I heard voices outside our cabin. One of them wasn't Murdoch's man." "Who was it?" Ezra asked. "Sounded like that Coleman fellow. The one who wants revenge on you, Ezra." Tom winced as he shifted his wounded shoulder. He was arguing with the others about the best way to flush you out. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. "You mean Murdoch and Coleman are working together now?" "Seems like it," Tom said. "Enemy of my enemy and all that." The news that their separate conflicts had merged into one larger threat made the situation feel hopeless. How could they fight an enemy that came at them from multiple directions with different motives? "We need to get word to the marshals," Doc Henderson decided. "This changes everything." "How?" Margaret asked. "By the time they get here, we could all be dead." "Then we make sure we're not dead when they arrive," Ben Morrison said with quiet determination. "We've been reacting to their moves. Time to make some moves of our own." Such as? Ezra asked. Ben's smile was sharp as a blade. Such as finding out exactly where Murdoch and Coleman are hiding and making sure the marshals know where to look for the evidence. Margaret felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. For too long, they had been victims waiting for the next attack. Maybe it was time to become hunters instead of prey. "What do you need us to do?" she asked. "First, we get Tom and Sarah somewhere safe," Ben said. "Then we start gathering information about our enemy's plans." As the neighbors began making plans and assigning tasks, Margaret felt the weight of helplessness begin to lift from her shoulders. They might be outnumbered and outgunned, but they had something their enemies didn't: a community that cared about each other and refused to be driven apart by fear. But even as hope began to return, Margaret couldn't forget the sight of the destroyed cabin or the sound of Tom and Sarah's terrified voices. The stakes were higher now, and the next mistake could cost lives. She only hoped they were strong enough to win a fight they had never wanted to start. Margaret crouched behind a fallen log in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing air as she watched the enemy camp through Ezra's hunting spyglass. 20 yards away, Jake Murdoch and Frank Coleman sat around a campfire with 6 other men, planning their next attack like generals preparing for war. "Can you hear what they're saying?" Ezra whispered beside her. Margaret strained to catch the voices drifting across the snowy clearing. Something about the marshals returning tomorrow, and finishing this before they can interfere. The past 3 days had been a deadly game of cat and mouse. While Tom and Sarah recovered in the safety of Doc Henderson's house in town, Margaret and Ezra had been tracking their enemies through the mountain wilderness. What they had discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. "There," Margaret breathed, pointing toward the edge of the camp. "Look at all those dynamite boxes." Ezra adjusted the spyglass and cursed under his breath. Enough explosive to level half the mountain settlements. They're not planning to scare people away anymore. They're planning to destroy everything. Margaret felt sick as the full scope of their enemy's plan became clear. Murdoch and Coleman weren't just trying to drive out a few troublesome families. They were preparing to eliminate every witness to their crimes. "We have to warn everyone," she whispered. "First, we have to get out of here alive," Ezra replied grimly. "And then we have to make sure the marshals have proof of what these men are planning." As they prepared to slip away through the forest, Margaret heard voices getting closer to their hiding spot. She grabbed Ezra's arm and pointed toward 2 men walking in their direction, carrying rifles and talking in low voices. "Should have killed that Barren woman first," one of them was saying. "Would have saved us a lot of trouble." "Coleman wants the husband alive long enough to watch his wife die," the other replied with a cruel laugh. "Says it's only fair after what happened to his brother." Margaret felt rage build in her chest like a forest fire. These men talked about killing her, like she was an animal to be hunted, something without value or worth. But she was more than they would ever understand. A woman who had found her strength in the mountains, who had built a community from nothing, who had learned to fight for what mattered. Ezra's hand tightened on his rifle as the 2 men passed within arm's reach of their hiding place. Margaret held her breath, knowing that discovery now would mean certain death. But the men continued past, without noticing the shadows that weren't quite right behind the fallen log. When the voices faded into distance, Margaret and Ezra began their careful retreat through the forest. Every step had to be silent, every movement planned to avoid detection. The enemy camp was positioned perfectly to watch all the obvious escape routes. "This way," Ezra breathed, leading her along a game trail that wound between thick stands of pine trees. They had gone perhaps half a mile when Margaret heard the sound that made her blood freeze, dogs barking in the distance, growing closer. "They're tracking us," she whispered. "Run," Ezra said simply. They abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through the underbrush as the baying of hunting dogs grew louder behind them. Margaret's lungs burned in the cold air, and her legs ached from running through deep snow, but terror gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "There," Ezra pointed toward a rocky outcrop ahead. "If we can reach those boulders, we can make a stand." They scrambled up the rocky slope as the first riders appeared through the trees below. Margaret could see Jake Murdoch in the lead, his face twisted with fury as he spotted them climbing toward the rocks. "You can't run forever," Murdoch shouted up at them. "Might as well give up now and save everyone some trouble." "Go to hell!" Margaret shouted back, surprising herself with her defiance. Ezra had found a defensible position among the boulders, with clear views of all the approaches and good cover from enemy fire. As he checked his rifle, Margaret realized they were about to fight for their lives. "How many bullets do you have?" she asked. "Enough," Ezra said grimly. "But Margaret, if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Margaret interrupted fiercely. "We're going to get out of this, warn the others, and see these bastards pay for what they've done." The first shots rang out as their enemies spread out to surround the rocky outcrop. Margaret grabbed Ezra's backup rifle and checked that it was loaded. She had never shot at another human being, but she was ready to learn. "Remember," Ezra said as bullets began pinging off the rocks around them, "we just need to hold them off until help arrives." "What help?" Margaret asked, then heard the answer in the distance, the sound of many horses approaching fast. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see riders cresting the ridge above the enemy camp, federal marshals, mountain neighbors, and even some townspeople from Missoula, all armed and ready to fight. Doc Henderson. Margaret breathed in relief. He brought the cavalry. Below them, their enemies suddenly found themselves caught between two forces, Margaret and Ezra on the high ground, and a small army of angry mountain folks charging down from above. "Surrender!" Marshal Davies' voice boomed across the clearing. "You're surrounded." The battle that followed was brief and decisive. Caught in the open with nowhere to run, Murdoch and Coleman's men threw down their weapons rather than face certain death. As Margaret watched the marshals arrest the men who had terrorized her community, she felt something she had never experienced before, the satisfaction of seeing justice done by her own hand. "It's over," Ezra said, wrapping his arms around her. Margaret leaned against her husband's solid warmth and looked out over the mountains that had become her home. "No," she said with quiet certainty, "it's just beginning." 5 years after Margaret first walked into the Bitterroot Mountains, carrying nothing but shame and a battered leather satchel, she stood on the porch of what had once been a simple cabin and was now the heart of something extraordinary. The settlement spread out before her like a living testament to what people could build when they refused to accept the world's judgment. The morning sun painted the peaks gold as Margaret watched children run between the buildings, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Some were orphans who had found their way here through the mountain network. Others belonged to the 23 families who now called this place home. All of them had one thing in common. They had been told they didn't belong somewhere else. "Mrs. Blackwood?" A young voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret turned to see Jenny Coleman, Frank Coleman's niece, who had arrived 3 months ago after her uncle's trial and imprisonment. The girl was barely 16, pregnant and abandoned, but her eyes held the same fierce determination Margaret remembered seeing in her own mirror years ago. "The weaving orders for next month are ready," Jenny said, holding out a carefully written ledger. "Mrs. Henderson thinks we'll need to hire more workers if the demand keeps growing." Margaret smiled as she took the book. The settlement's textile operation had grown from Ruth Morrison's simple loom to a thriving business that supplied goods as far away as Portland. More importantly, it gave women a way to support themselves while they figured out what came next. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, noticing how Jenny's hand rested protectively over her growing belly. "Scared," Jenny admitted, "but the good kind of scared, if that makes sense. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you can fly." It made perfect sense to Margaret. She had learned there were many kinds of fear: the paralyzing fear of other people's judgment, and the energizing fear of possibility and growth. The first kind destroyed dreams, the second kind built them. "Mrs. Blackwood," another voice called from across the settlement common. "The supply wagon's here, and Pete says he's got mail." Margaret walked toward the wagon where Pete Richardson was unloading supplies with the help of several settlement women. At 65, Pete moved a little slower than he used to, but his grin was as wide as ever when he saw her approaching. "Got something special for you today," Pete said, handing her an official-looking envelope. "From the territorial governor himself." Margaret broke the seal and read the formal language that made her heart race with excitement. "Ezra!" she called toward the workshop where her husband was teaching carpentry. You need to see this! Ezra emerged with wood shavings in his beard and curiosity in his blue eyes. What is it? The territorial government wants to make this an official town, Margaret said, hardly believing the words herself. They're offering to establish a post office, a school district, and even a marshal's office if we want one. The news spread through the settlement like wildfire, bringing people out of their houses and workshops to gather around the supply wagon. Faces that had once been marked by fear and desperation now glowed with pride and possibility. What would we call it? Asked Sarah Mitchell, who had become the settlement's unofficial teacher after the new cabin was built to replace the one destroyed by dynamite. Angel's Rest, several voices said at once. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Somewhere along the way, travelers and traders had started calling her the Angel of the Bitterroots, a name she found both embarrassing and oddly fitting. Not because she was perfect or saintly, but because she had learned that angels were often just broken people who helped others learn to fly. I like it, Ezra said, wrapping his arm around Margaret's waist. Angel's Rest it is. As the celebration continued around them, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had been cast out for being barren, labeled worthless by people who claimed to love her. But in losing the ability to bear children, she had discovered something else entirely, the ability to nurture hope in places where it had never grown before. The settlement now housed 37 people, from Jenny's unborn baby to old Pete Richardson, who had decided to retire here rather than continue his mountain rounds. They came for different reasons, some fleeing violence, others escaping poverty, many simply looking for a place where they could be themselves without apology. Do you ever miss the quiet? Margaret asked Ezra as they watched children chase each other around the common area. Sometimes, Ezra admitted, but then I remember that quiet and peace aren't the same thing. This is better than quiet. Margaret nodded, understanding completely. They had built something unprecedented in these mountains, a place where a woman's worth wasn't measured by her ability to bear children or please men, but by her capacity to create, to care, to contribute in whatever way felt authentic to her. As evening approached and the settlement began to settle into its nighttime routines, Margaret walked to the small building that served as their community center. On the wall hung a wooden sign, carved by one of the women who had learned woodworking in Ezra's shop. Here, you are enough. Beside it hung another sign, the original piece of wood her father had forced her to wear, with Barren carved in his unforgiving hand. But now it served a different purpose. Below the cruel word, someone had added new carving, but not broken. MB. Margaret traced the letters with her finger, remembering the day she had first arrived in these mountains, lost, ashamed, carrying nothing but the weight of other people's judgment. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known in a previous life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken years of small choices, daily acts of courage, and the gradual understanding that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. She was valuable because she existed, because she could love and create and choose to make the world a little better than she found it. Mrs. Blackwood? Jenny appeared in the doorway, her young face thoughtful. Can I ask you something? Of course. Were you ever afraid you'd made the wrong choice? Coming here, I mean. Starting over when everyone said you should be grateful for whatever scraps they offered? Margaret considered the question seriously. Every day for the first year, she said honestly. But then I realized I was asking the wrong question. What do you mean? I was asking whether other people would approve of my choices, instead of asking whether my choices were true to who I really was. Margaret smiled at the girl who reminded her so much of her younger self. Once I started asking the right question, the fear got smaller. As Jenny headed back to her own cabin, Margaret remained in the community center, surrounded by the tools and records and evidence of what they had built together. Through the windows, she could see lights glowing in cabins throughout the settlement, each one representing a life that had been transformed by the simple, radical act of being accepted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be babies to deliver, conflicts to resolve, crops to plant, and probably more wounded souls finding their way up the mountain trail. But tonight, Margaret felt something she had spent most of her life searching for without knowing it, the deep satisfaction of living authentically, of building something meaningful, of discovering that the very qualities that made her unsuitable for one life made her perfect for another. In the end, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Worth wasn't something bestowed by others or taken away by circumstances. It was something that lived within, waiting to be recognized, nurtured, and shared. And here in Angel's Rest, high in the Bitterroot Mountains where decent women weren't supposed to venture alone, that truth had taken root and flourished. One woman, one choice, one reclaimed life at a time. The angel of the Bitterroots wasn't an angel because she was perfect. She was an angel because she had learned to help others discover they had wings.